Gospel Topic Essays, Book of Mormon, and DNA Studies. In this series, I will thoroughly examine the Gospel Topics essays published on the official LDS Church website. Each essay will be addressed in the order presented by the Church, offering a critical and in-depth analysis of the topics they cover. Part 1. What does the Gospel Topic Essays have to say? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints affirms that the Book of Mormon is a volume of sacred scripture comparable to the Bible. It contains a record of God's dealings with three groups of people who migrated from the Near East or West Asia to the Americas hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. Stop right there. From the very first statement, the LDS Church is already misleading its audience. The Book of Mormon doesn't deal with three groups of people. It deals with four. We have the Jaredites, the Nephites, the Lamanites, and the Mulekites. Although the Nephites and Lamanites supposedly originated from the same family line, brothers who allegedly split into warring factions, the Book of Mormon makes it clear that the Nephites were portrayed as light-skinned, while the Lamanites were cursed with dark skin and later conflated with Native American peoples. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's keep unraveling the claims. Although the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical, some people have wondered whether the migrations it describes are compatible with scientific studies of ancient America. The discussion has centered on the field of population genetics and developments in DNA science. Some have contended that the migrations mentioned in the Book of Mormon did not occur because the majority of DNA identified to date in modern native peoples most closely resembles that of Eastern Asian populations. Hold up, let's dissect this carefully. The LDS Church conveniently downplays the Book of Mormon's historical claims by reframing it as a spiritual text. Yet for decades, the Church pushed it as a literal history of the Americas. In fact, the 1980 introduction to the Book of Mormon explicitly stated that the Lamanites were the sole remnant of Native Americans. So now we have to ask, is the Book of Mormon historical fact, or merely a collection of spiritual messages? If it's more spiritual than historical, then why has the Church spent generations teaching it as literal history? Basic principles of population genetics suggest the need for a more careful approach to the data. The conclusions of genetics, like those of any science, are tentative, and much work remains to be done to fully understand the origins of the native populations of the Americas. This statement is a desperate attempt to muddy the waters and dismiss decades of rigorous genetic research. Let's be absolutely clear, the science is not tentative. The overwhelming consensus in the scientific community confirms that Native Americans descend from populations originating in Siberia and Mongolia more than 15,000 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, passed from mother to child, has been meticulously analyzed across Native American groups and compared to both ancient and modern Eurasian populations. Haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, found in Native Americans, match those in Siberian and East Asian populations. Haplogroup X2A, often used by fringe theories to claim pre-Columbian European ancestry, is actually traced back to ancient Siberians, not Europeans. Similarly, Native American males predominantly belong to Y chromosome haplogroup Q, common in Siberian and Mongolian populations. The Bering Land Bridge migration theory isn't speculation, it's scientific fact, supported by archaeological, genetic, and geological evidence. DNA markers reveal these migrations during the last ice age. Claims that Native American DNA could somehow hide a Near Eastern origin are not only scientifically baseless, but outright disingenuous. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples, and even if their genetic profile were known, there are sound scientific reasons that it might remain undetected. For these same reasons, arguments that some defenders of the Book of Mormon make, based on DNA studies, are also speculative. In short, DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon. This statement is pure deflection, a last-ditch effort to dodge the undeniable truth. Let's address their so-called sound scientific reasons. The Church has vaguely suggested bottlenecks or genetic drift to explain why DNA from Book of Mormon peoples might remain undetectable. But science has identified genetic bottlenecks dating back to the Paleolithic period, over 20,000 years ago when Siberian populations crossed into the Americas. These bottlenecks did not erase their DNA, and neither would any hypothetical bottleneck for Book of Mormon populations. The reality is this: no Near Eastern or West Asian genetic markers have ever been found in pre-Columbian Native American populations. Period. The evidence consistently refutes the LDS Church's narrative. The Church's ongoing narrative shifts, desperately moving from historical fact to spiritual purpose, underscore their inability to reconcile scientific facts with their claims. As Dr. Michael Crawford, an expert in biological anthropology, put it, the genetic data unequivocally supports the idea that the initial peopling of the Americas came from Siberia. Meanwhile, LDS apologists offer nothing but speculation and word games to distract from the truth. Their argument collapses under the weight of evidence. Part 2. The Ancestors of the American Indians. The evidence assembled to date suggests that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. Scientists theorize that in an era that predated Book of Mormon accounts, a relatively small group of people migrated from Northeast Asia to the Americas by way of a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska. These people, scientists say, spread rapidly to fill North and South America, and were likely the primary ancestors of modern American Indians. The evidence doesn't just suggest this, it proves it. Native Americans did indeed come from Asia via the Beringian land bridge around 20,000 years ago. While there's still some debate about whether this migration was along the Pacific coast or through an ice sheet gap in modern-day Alberta, Canada, one thing is clear: the migration happened during the last ice age. Scientists aren't guessing, they're proving it with irrefutable evidence. DNA analysis verifies this migration. It doesn't support the Book of Mormon's version of history, it confirms the science. The Book of Mormon provides little direct information about cultural contact between the peoples it describes and others who may have lived nearby. Consequently, most early Latter-day Saints assumed that Near Easterners or West Asians like Jared, Lehi, Mulek, and their companions were the first or the largest or even the only groups to settle the Americas. Building upon this assumption, critics insist that the Book of Mormon does not allow for the presence of other large populations in the Americas, and that therefore, Near Eastern DNA should be easily identifiable among modern native groups. The Church is basically asking us to accept that these Near Eastern groups were isolated, with little to no interaction with anyone else. But why is it that the Book of Mormon mentions only 4 cultures, all supposedly originating from the Holy Land? The Nephites, Lamanites, Mulekites, and Jaredites, no others. No mention of the civilizations that actually thrived across the Americas. No Aztecs, Olmecs, or Incas. These empires built cities and monuments that still stand today. Where are they in the Book of Mormon? Why is there no mention of them? If these groups lived on the same land, wouldn't their paths have crossed? Instead, we're left with the improbable narrative of 4 isolated groups, no diversification of culture or interaction with the civilizations around them. The Book of Mormon itself, however, does not claim that the peoples it describes were either the predominant or the exclusive inhabitants of the lands they occupied. In fact, cultural and demographic clues in its text hint at the presence of other groups. At the April 1929 General Conference, President Anthony W. Ivins of the First Presidency cautioned, "We must be careful in the conclusions that we reach. The Book of Mormon does not tell us that there was no one here before them, the peoples it describes. It does not tell us that people did not come after." This claim is a convenient cop-out. They say cultural and demographic clues hint at other groups, but if all these so-called clues are just splinter groups of Nephites, Lamanites, or Jaredites, then there's no actual evidence of non-Book of Mormon peoples. No independent civilizations. No outsiders with their own cultures. The Book of Mormon is narrowly focused on a handful of groups, and any clues about others can easily be explained away as part of that narrative. So where are these other groups? Where's the concrete evidence? Where's the text? Nothing is known about the extent of intermarriage and genetic mixing between Book of Mormon peoples or their descendants and other inhabitants of the Americas, though some mixing appears evident, even during the period covered by the book's text. What seems clear is that the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples likely represented only a fraction of all DNA in ancient America. Finding and clearly identifying their DNA today may be asking more of the science of population genetics than it is capable of providing. If we don't know anything about intermarriage, how can we claim that DNA markers of these people are even present in modern populations? Genetic markers exist to tell us about heritage, about lineage, and if the DNA of these peoples was such a fraction of the ancient population, it would be relatively easy to identify it. If the Book of Mormon people were a small part of a much larger population, their genetic markers would still stand out. DNA doesn't ask too much of science. It provides clear, identifiable evidence. It's not some abstract concept. It's concrete. And the evidence doesn't support the idea that the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples is somehow lost or indeterminate. Part 3. Understanding the genetic evidence. The church in this section decides they will play along the evolutionary line and try to become fancy, yet they are playing coy at the same time. A brief review of the basic principles of genetics will help explain how scientists use DNA to study ancient populations. It will also highlight the difficulty of drawing conclusions about the Book of Mormon from the study of genetics. Now let's catch the church in its own catch-22. The church states, at the present time, scientific consensus holds that the vast majority of Native Americans belong to sub-branches of the Y chromosome haplogroups C and Q14 and the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, all of which appear to have come to the Americas via migrations from East Asia 15. Ongoing studies continue to provide new insights that both challenge and confirm previous conclusions. For example, a 2014 study indicates that as much as one-third of Native American DNA may have originated anciently in Europe or West Asia. From this evidence, scientists conclude that some Europeans or West Asians migrated eastward across Asia, mixing with a group that eventually migrated to the Americas, millennia before the events described in the Book of Mormon. Now wait a moment, this sounds like genetic drift, where DNA gets mixed enough that it is no hard to follow the trail, just like those of the Book of Mormon peoples. If we can follow the genetic drift of the Europeans and West Asians who migrated across into Siberia and Mongolia, then eventually into the Americas over 20,000 years back, and DNA degrades over time, how it is possible then that we cannot find genetic markers for the Book of Mormon peoples who came to the Americans 18,000 years later? We cannot have genetic drift being able to follow some, but not others. This is merely the church covering their tracks, poorly at that. Additional DNA markers from Europe, West Asia, and Africa exist in the DNA of modern native populations, but it is difficult to determine whether they are the result of migrations that predated Columbus, such as those described in the Book of Mormon, or whether they stem from genetic mixing that occurred after the European conquest. This is due in part to the fact that the molecular clock used by scientists to date Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA markers is not sufficiently sensitive to pinpoint the timing of migrations that occurred as recently as a few hundred or even a few thousand years ago. Moreover, no molecular clock is currently available for complete genomes. I hate to say it, but I cannot help but laugh here. The statement of, but it is difficult to determine whether they are the result of migrations that predated Columbus, is outrageous to say the least. We know that the Native American populations have been here 20,000 plus years at least. Not only does DNA back this up, but archaeological digs and discoveries have been made. Carbon-14 dating has been conducted, and several sites discovered continue to have their dates pushed back in time as more is discovered. The church proceeds with the following. Scientists do not rule out the possibility of additional small-scale migrations to the Americas. For example, a 2010 genetic analysis of a well-preserved 4,000-year-old Paleo-Eskimo in Greenland led scientists to hypothesize that a group of people besides those from East Asia had migrated to the Americas. Commenting on this study, population geneticist Marcus Feldman of Stanford University said, "Models that suggest a single one-time migration are generally regarded as idealized systems. There may have been small amounts of migrations going on for millennia." Please go back and reread the church's statement. Greenland is on the east of northern North America, nowhere close to the Beringian land bridge and crossing. As well, the discovery of the Paleo-Eskimo was from 4,000 years ago, way outside of the timeline. We know the Siberian-Mongolian ancestors had already crossed into the Americas. At the latest, we have the Clovis first people coming into the Americas around 12,000 BC, and Paleo-Indians at least 20,000 BC, which places the Paleo-Eskimo 8,000–16,000 years after the waves of migrations into the Americas. This is a classic fail on the Church's part and an attempted deflection. Part 4. The Founder Effect. Once again, the Church places both its members and critics in an untenable position with the following claim. One reason it is difficult to use DNA evidence to draw definite conclusions about Book of Mormon peoples is that nothing is known about the DNA that Lehi, Sariah, Ishmael, and others brought to the Americas. Even if geneticists had a database of the DNA that now exists among all modern American Indian groups, it would be impossible to know exactly what to search for. It is possible that each member of the emigrating parties described in the Book of Mormon had DNA typical of the Near East, but it is likewise possible that some of them carried DNA more typical of other regions. In this case, their descendants might inherit a genetic profile that would be unexpected given their family's place of origin. This phenomenon is called the founder effect. This argument is not only weak, it is an outright misdirection. Sure, the Church is right that nothing is known about the DNA that Lehi and his family brought with them, but that doesn't mean there should be no trace left behind of their purported Near Eastern origins. The concept of the founder effect is introduced here, but the Church conveniently overlooks the fact that such an effect might reduce the frequency of certain genetic markers, but does not erase them entirely. If the Book of Mormon story were true, and the Lehite migrants did indeed mix with the indigenous populations of the Americas, we would still expect to find some trace of Near Eastern genetic markers in Native American populations, even if diluted. Small-scale migrations from the Near East or Eurasia, such as the Vikings in Greenland or Jews in Ethiopia, have left behind distinct genetic markers in local populations. In both cases, despite significant mixing, genetic evidence still lingers, bearing witness to those ancient migrations. Why is it that the Church would claim that DNA from Lehi's migration could somehow disappear entirely? Dr. Ugo A. Perego, a Latter-day Saint population geneticist, presents a perfect counterexample. He states, consider the case of Dr. Ugo A. Perego, a Latter-day Saint population geneticist. His genealogy confirms that he is a multi-generation Italian, but the DNA of his paternal genetic lineage is from a branch of the Asian Native American haplogroup C. This likely means that somewhere along the line, a migratory event from Asia to Europe led to the introduction of DNA atypical of Perego's place of origin. Perego's case is instructive. His paternal lineage traces back to Asian Native American haplogroup C, an indication that a migratory event from Asia to Europe occurred far in the past, leaving a lasting genetic mark. His DNA, linked to a distant ancestor from a completely different region, still contains genetic evidence of this migration. This proves migration events leave traces in DNA, traces that don't disappear with time, and certainly not after a mere 2 millennia, as the Church suggests. This directly contradicts the Church's claim that Lehi's DNA could have vanished or been completely diluted. Perego's example is a clear example of genetic persistence despite long separation from the ancestral population. The founder effect may dilute the markers but will never erase them, especially within a population as large and widespread as that of the Book of Mormon's supposed migrants. The Church's attempt to obfuscate the issue, to suggest that Lehi's DNA could be lost to history, is nothing more than an effort to cover up the glaring absence of any genetic proof for the Book of Mormon's historical narrative. The claim that Lehi's descendants could have mixed with indigenous populations in such a way that the Near Eastern markers simply vanished is not only scientifically dubious, but also dismissive of well-established genetic principles. It falls apart completely when we look at real-world examples, like Dr. Perego's own DNA, which has preserved traces of migration events from thousands of years ago. The Church's argument fails to hold water for anyone who is willing to examine the evidence carefully, and their attempt to be coy, to mislead both members and potential converts becomes painfully apparent. Their grasp on genetic science is weak at best and easily debunked by the evidence that is readily available. This is not just an issue of genetic drift, which we've already addressed. It is about the founder effect and the persistence of genetic markers through time. And the Church's attempts to use this concept as a smokescreen for the complete absence of evidence for the Book of Mormon's historical claims only exposes their unwillingness to confront the hard facts head-on. Part 5. Conclusion. Much as critics and defenders of the Book of Mormon would like to use DNA studies to support their views, the evidence is simply inconclusive. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples. Even if such information were known, processes such as population bottleneck, genetic drift, and post-Columbian immigration from West Eurasia make it unlikely that their DNA could be detected today. As Elder Dallin H. Oakes of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles observed, "It is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon." This is perhaps the most dishonest attempt by the Church to sidestep the glaring issues at hand. The Church, rather than confronting the scientific evidence head-on, seeks to mislead the reader with half-truths and false information. The statement that nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples is a deliberate obfuscation intended to distract from the undeniable fact that there is no evidence supporting the Book of Mormon's narrative. The argument that processes like genetic drift or population bottleneck would have erased any traces of Near Eastern DNA is an appeal to confusion, an attempt to muddy the waters and make it seem as though there are too many variables to settle the issue definitively. However, this is simply not the case. DNA does not lie. It is concrete. It is the same immutable evidence we use in a court of law to convict criminals and exonerate the innocent. The idea that genetic markers from the Book of Mormon peoples could have vanished through natural processes like genetic drift or bottlenecking without leaving a trace is a scientific fallacy. As Dr. Hugo A. Perego demonstrated, DNA from distant migrations persists for millennia, even across continents. If there had been migration from the Near East to the Americas, we should see lingering genetic markers, and we do not. This is not an issue of inconclusive evidence. This is an issue of complete absence of evidence. Moreover, Elder Dallin H. Oakes' statement that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon is a dangerous and deliberate evasion. What Oakes conveniently ignores is that secular evidence, in this case genetics, is not inconclusive. It is clear, verifiable, and irrefutable. DNA evidence is among the most reliable forms of evidence we have in modern science, and its failure to show the existence of any Near Eastern markers in Native American populations is the clear answer to the Book of Mormon's historical claims. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.